My husband walked out of the Cartier boutique while I was paying. Just a few minutes he smiled, kissing my forehead with that perfect practiced charm of his. Let me go get the car. I waited, holding my breath with excitement over what I thought was an anniversary surprise. Then a store manager approached me looking absolutely terrified and whispered, "Ma'am, please come with me to the VIP room." What he showed me on his computer screen was an $85,000 charge that would instantly destroy my marriage, bankrupt my deceptive family, and unleash a level of retaliation they never saw coming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a betrayal so deep it changed your entire life forever. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old, sitting in my Atlanta penthouse, looking out at the glittering city skyline with a glass of dark red wine in my hand. It is peaceful here now, high above the chaotic streets, but the storm that brought me to this exact moment was absolutely brutal. You see, I am a forensic financial investigator for the federal government. I spend my days tracking hidden money, exposing massive corporate fraud, and dismantling complex criminal enterprises for a living. I am trained to spot lies in spreadsheets and deception in bank statements. Yet for years, the biggest fraud of all was sleeping right next to me in my own bed, sharing my life and my future. His name was Marcus. Marcus was 38 years old, a highly successful and incredibly charismatic commercial real estate broker handling multi-million-dollar properties across the state. We had the kind of marriage that looked completely flawless to outsiders. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a sleek luxury car, and always knew exactly what to say to charm any room he walked into. We shared a beautiful, sprawling, neoclassical home in a wealthy Atlanta neighborhood. It was a house I had actually purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money before we even got married, though. Marcus loved to act like he was the king of the castle. A month prior to that fateful day at the jewelry store, my beloved grandfather passed away. He was the only person in my family who genuinely believed in me, and he left me a very substantial inheritance. I trusted Marcus implicitly, so I deposited the entire sum into our joint savings account. I was planning to use it for our shared future, maybe even to start a college fund for the children we were actively talking about having. I wanted to build a legacy. I had no earthly idea that my absolute trust was just another financial asset for him to coldly exploit. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus insisted on taking me out shopping in Buckhead. He claimed he wanted to buy me something incredibly special for our upcoming wedding anniversary. He said I worked too hard tracking criminals and deserved to be completely spoiled. The Cartier boutique was immaculate, all gleaming glass display cases, polished marble floors, and soft, flattering light that made everything sparkle. We spent nearly an hour looking at several pieces. He was being so exceptionally attentive, holding my hand, whispering sweet things in my ear, and acting like the perfect devoted husband. When he briefly stepped away to take a phone call, I assumed it was just another high-stakes real estate deal that demanded his immediate attention. He came back a few minutes later, casually slipping his premium credit card back into his designer wallet. He leaned down, kissed my forehead tenderly, and gave my waist a gentle squeeze. "Just a few minutes," he said, flashing that trademark smile. "Let me go get the car pulled around so you do not have to walk in the heat." I smiled back at him, watching him walk out the heavy glass doors, truly feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. I stood near the front display cases, admiring a collection of watches, simply waiting for the sales associate to bring out the beautifully wrapped gift bag. The minutes ticked by. I checked my phone, expecting a text saying he was at the curb. Instead, the store manager walked out from the back office. He was a tall, distinguished man in a sharp suit, but his face had completely lost its color. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He approached me very cautiously, glancing around nervously to make sure no other customers or employees were close enough to listen to us. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a strained, nervous whisper, "please come with me to the VIP room." My heart fluttered with a sudden spike of anxiety. Was there a problem with the card? Had someone stolen our identity? I followed him into a private velvet-lined room tucked away from the main sales floor. He closed the heavy oak door behind us with a solid click and gestured for me to look toward his computer monitor. "I am so sorry to bother you with this," he stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But our internal fraud alert system flagged a highly unusual transaction on your joint account. Since you are an authorized signer on the account and you are physically present in the store, I felt ethically obligated to verify it with you privately before the items leave the premises." I stepped closer to the glowing screen, completely unprepared for what I was about to see. My eyes scanned the digital invoice, and the air completely left my lungs. There, staring back at me in stark black and white text, was a completed transaction for $85,000. The payment had been pulled directly from the joint account where I had just deposited my dead grandfather's inheritance money. But it was not for the modest anniversary watch we had been discussing on the sales floor. The invoice clearly listed a custom ruby-studded diamond necklace, a piece of jewelry so extravagant it belonged on a gala red carpet. But the price tag was not the part that made my blood run cold. My eyes drifted down the screen to the specific delivery details. Marcus had not purchased this piece to take home to me. He had arranged for secure insured delivery to a completely different address. I recognized that address instantly. I knew it by heart. It was a luxury apartment complex right in the center of downtown Atlanta, the exact apartment where my younger sister Chloe lived. Chloe was the pampered golden child of my family. She was the sister my mother constantly favored, protected and elevated above me at every single opportunity. My husband had just used my dead grandfather's hard-earned money to secretly buy an $85,000 diamond and ruby necklace for my own sister. I did not scream. I did not cry. A strange, freezing calm washed over my entire body, starting from my chest and spreading out to my fingertips. The naive, loving wife who had walked into that jewelry store died right there in that quiet VIP room. In her place, the federal forensic accountant took over, calculating, observant, and ready to dismantle their lives piece by piece. The store manager swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the box of tissues on the mahogany desk, clearly expecting me to burst into a hysterical fit of tears. I did not shed a single one. Crying is a luxury for women who have the safety net of a loving partner to fall back on. I had just become a woman standing entirely alone, and alone meant I had to be lethal. My posture straightened, the warmth drained from my face replaced by the rigid clinical focus that had earned me my badge at the federal agency. I looked at the manager, my voice completely devoid of any tremor. "Print it. I want the detailed invoice, the shipping manifest, and a complete transaction history of every purchase my husband has made at this boutique over the last 3 years." The manager hesitated, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Mom's store policy usually requires the primary cardholder's consent for historical data." I placed my hands flat on the desk, leaning in just enough to let him know I was not asking for a favor. "My name is on the joint account that just funded an $85,000 purchase. That makes me an equal owner of the transaction and a potential victim of grand larceny. You have 2 choices. You can print the records for me right now as a courtesy to a defrauded client, or you can print them tomorrow when I return with a federal subpoena and a team of agents who will tear this store apart looking for complicity in wire fraud. Which option works best for your schedule?" He did not say another word. The printer in the corner immediately hummed to life. As the pages slid into the tray, my mind shifted entirely into investigator mode. I was no longer Maya, the devoted wife. I was Maya, the forensic auditor, and Marcus was simply a target, a puzzle of numbers and deceptive routing digits waiting to be cracked. I snatched the warm papers from the tray and began to scan the columns. The numbers told a story that was simultaneously sickening and fascinating. My husband was not just a cheating spouse, he was a sloppy criminal. For a man who prided himself on his brilliant commercial real estate deals, he had made the amateur mistake of getting greedy. He needed liquid cash to buy a piece of jewelry that extravagant, and his own business accounts must have been tied up or heavily monitored by his partners. So he waited. He waited like a predator for my grandfather's inheritance to clear into our joint savings. He used the tragic death of the only man who ever truly loved me to fund his disgusting betrayal. But the true gut punch was not the money, it was the destination. My eyes locked onto the shipping address printed flawlessly under the item description. Unit 4B Peachtree Luxury Lofts. The text burned itself into my retinas. It was Chloe, my younger sister, the golden child of our family. For my entire life, my mother Vivian had placed Chloe on a pedestal so high it cast a permanent shadow over everything I ever accomplished. Chloe was the beautiful one, the delicate one, the one who needed constant protection and financial bailouts. When I earned a full academic scholarship to Spelman College, my mother guilt-tripped me into declining it so the family funds could go toward Chloe's expensive, out-of-state tuition. I was forced to take on crushing student loans because, according to my mother, Chloe needed a better launching pad while I was tough enough to handle the struggle. I had spent years building my career from the ground up, fighting for every promotion, studying late into the night to pass my certification exams, all while Chloe floated through life on a cloud of family subsidies and endless excuses. And through it all, Marcus had played the supportive brother-in-law. I suddenly remembered all the family dinners where Marcus would defend Chloe's reckless spending. I remembered him helping her move into that exact apartment at Peachtree Luxury Lofts, carrying her heavy boxes, laughing at her jokes, and telling me I needed to be easier on her. They had been playing me for an absolute fool. My own sister and my husband laughing behind my back, sleeping together, and now funding their luxury lifestyle with my dead grandfather's money. I flipped to the second page of the printout. There were other charges. A $5,000 watch here, a $10,000 pair of diamond earrings there, all purchased within the last 2 years, all conveniently timed around Chloe's birthdays or major holidays. The financial trail was glaringly obvious now that I knew what to look for. Marcus had been siphoning smaller amounts, testing the waters, making sure I was too busy with my high-stakes federal cases to notice the discrepancies in our own backyard. But $85,000 was a massive escalation. It was bold, it was arrogant. It was the move of a man who thought he was completely untouchable. He thought I was just a blind, trusting wife who would never question a sudden dip in our savings, especially since he had probably planned to quickly replace the money after his next real estate commission cleared. That is how Ponzi schemers operate. They borrow against tomorrow to pay for their sins today. But Marcus had grossly miscalculated. He forgot that the woman he married dismantled white-collar criminals before lunch. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. I pictured Chloe's smug face, probably waiting in her upscale apartment right now, expecting a special delivery. I pictured my mother, who would undoubtedly find some twisted way to blame me for driving my husband into my sister's arms if she ever found out. They all thought I was the rigid, boring accountant. They thought I was too focused on spreadsheets to understand the real world. I folded the papers with razor-sharp precision and slid them perfectly into my designer handbag. The air in the VIP room felt freezing, but my blood was boiling with a cold, calculated fury. I did not feel broken. I felt dangerously empowered. The betrayal was so profound, so layered with family toxicity and marital deceit, that it completely bypassed my heart and went straight to my intellect. The store manager stood quietly by the door, watching me with a mixture of awe and terror. He had clearly expected a hysterical breakdown, shattered glass, maybe some screaming. Instead, he witnessed the terrifying quiet of a woman mapping out a war. "I will be keeping these," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You are going to cancel this delivery order immediately. But you will not process the refund just yet. Leave the charge exactly as it is for the next 24 hours. If my husband calls to inquire, you will tell him the piece is undergoing a final quality inspection before dispatch. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mum." He nodded quickly, looking relieved that he was not going to be facing a federal subpoena. "Whatever you need." I turned my back to him and pulled my phone from my pocket. My icy stare remained fixed on the reflection of myself in the dark glass of the display cabinet. The woman looking back at me was no longer a victim. She was an executioner preparing the guillotine. I dialed the direct unlisted number for the bank's high net worth fraud department, a number I knew by heart from my professional investigations. The line rang only once before a representative answered. Yes, I said, my tone absolute and unwavering. My name is Maya. I need to report a massive unauthorized fraudulent transaction on my joint account. And I need you to initiate a total immediate freeze on all connected corporate and personal assets under my husband's social security number. Shut it all down, right now. The heavy oak doors of my mother Vivian's estate in Alpharetta always felt more like the gates of a beautifully decorated prison than a family home. Sunday dinners here were a long-standing tradition, a weekly theatrical performance where we all gathered around a massive mahogany table to pretend we were the perfect affluent African-American family. The dining room smelled rich and comforting, a heavy blend of slow-cooked collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, smothered turkey wings, and candied yams. It was a feast designed to project maternal warmth, yet the air in the room was suffocatingly cold. I sat near the center of the table sipping a glass of sweet tea, watching the fake polite smiles stretch across the faces of people who shared my blood but knew absolutely nothing about my soul. My mother Vivian sat at the head of the table wearing a silk blouse and pearls, holding court as she always did. She was currently praising Chloe for her recent venture into the local art scene. Chloe sat opposite me, glowing under our mother's absolute adoration. She looked perfect dressed in a designer pastel dress, her makeup flawless, her posture screaming of untouchable privilege. She was sipping her sparkling water, acting like the innocent youngest daughter who could do no wrong. I watched her lips curve into a smug little smile as Vivian bragged about Chloe's superior taste. My analytical mind processed the entire room not as a family gathering, but as an active crime scene. The perpetrators were currently comfortable, completely unaware that the federal investigator at the table had already built their cages. The heavy front door clicked shut and Marcus strode into the dining room. He was late as usual, blaming the Atlanta traffic and a supposedly grueling client meeting. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blazer and crisp white shirt, exuding the exact kind of wealthy, successful charm my mother absolutely worshipped. He walked straight toward my chair, his expensive cologne announcing his arrival before he even touched me. He leaned down, flashing his brilliantly white teeth, and wrapped his hand firmly around my waist. He kissed my cheek, playing the role of the devoted, hardworking husband to absolute perfection. "Sorry I am late, beautiful," he murmured loudly enough for the entire table to hear. He took the empty seat beside me and immediately began charming my mother, complimenting the spread of food and smoothly navigating the table conversation. He grabbed a heavy serving spoon and piled a massive portion of barbecue ribs onto his expensive china plate, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire financial empire had been entirely frozen by federal banking authorities less than 48 hours ago. I did not pull away when he touched my waist. I did not flinch. I let him get perfectly comfortable. I waited until the conversation hit a lull, until the only sound in the room was the clinking of silverware against expensive porcelain. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing against the crisp, folded paper I had secured from the jewelry boutique. I pulled out the detailed Cartier invoice. It was pristine, sharp, and deadly. Without raising my voice, without a single tremor in my hand, I dropped the piece of paper directly onto his plate. The receipt fluttered down and landed squarely in the center of his barbecue ribs. The dark, sticky sauce immediately began to soak into the edges of the paper, staining the ink that detailed an $85,000 charge for a ruby and diamond necklace. The sound of silverware abruptly stopped. The entire table froze. "What is this?" Maya Marcus asked, his perfectly crafted smile faltering. He reached down and pinched the corner of the paper, lifting it away from his food. His eyes scanned the top line, and I watched the exact moment his soul left his body. The arrogant, charming real estate broker vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered, panicked animal. His jaw went completely slack. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. I kept my voice dangerously level, pitching it so the entire table had to lean in to hear me. "It is a receipt, Marcus." I thought my mother would be incredibly interested to see the $85,000 custom ruby necklace you purchased using my dead grandfather's inheritance money. Though I am a bit confused as to why the shipping manifest lists Chloe's luxury apartment downtown as the delivery address. The silence that slammed into the dining room was heavy enough to crack the foundation of the house. Across the table, Chloe's face exploded into a violent, guilty red. Her flawless composure shattered into a million pieces. She dropped her fork, her eyes darting frantically between me, Marcus, and our mother. But Chloe was a master manipulator trained by the very best. Instead of confessing, her survival instincts kicked in. Her lower lip began to tremble. Large, perfect tears welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. She immediately covered her face with her hands, letting out a dramatic, breathy sob. "I do not know what you are talking about," Chloe cried, her voice pitching up into a childish whine. "Why are you always attacking me, Maya? I have not done anything. You are always trying to ruin my life, just because Mom is proud of me." She shrank back into her chair, playing the ultimate victim. She made herself look so small, so completely bullied by her mean, calculating older sister. It was a spectacular performance. Marcus scrambled to recover. His eyes darted around the table, sweating profusely under the collar of his expensive shirt. He threw the barbecue-stained receipt onto the table and let out a forced, incredibly unnatural laugh. "Maya, baby, you are completely misunderstanding the situation," Marcus stammered, his hands waving defensively. "You are taking this entirely out of context. It was a surprise. It was a congratulatory gift. Chloe just opened her new art gallery in Midtown, and I wanted to get her a piece that matched the aesthetic of her brand. It was supposed to be a surprise from both of us to celebrate her success as a business owner. You know I love supporting the family." I slowly turned my head to look at him. I let my eyes drag up and down his sweating, trembling frame. I did not blink. "A congratulatory gift," I repeated slowly, letting the absurdity of the lie hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "You stole $85,000 from the joint account where I deposited the money my grandfather left me to buy my sister a ruby necklace as a business present." "Yes," Marcus lied quickly, nodding his head far too fast. "Exactly. I was going to replace the funds next week as soon as my commission from the new commercial property deal cleared. I just needed liquid cash to secure the piece because it was a limited edition. I wanted to make your sister feel special on her big opening night. You know how important family support is to your mother." I turned my gaze back to Chloe, who was still sobbing into her napkin, peering at me through her fingers to see if the lie was sticking. They were pathetic. They were two sloppy thieves trying to construct a cover story on the fly, completely unaware that a federal financial investigator had already mapped out their entire timeline. I knew exactly where Marcus was on Tuesday afternoons. I knew exactly whose apartment he visited when he claimed to be showing commercial properties in downtown Atlanta. And I knew that $85,000 was not a gift for an art gallery opening. It was a desperate attempt to keep an expensive mistress happy. The tension in the room was explosive. I simply sat back in my chair, picked up my glass of sweet tea, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I did not need to yell. I did not need to throw plates or overturn the table. The receipt sitting in a puddle of barbecue sauce was doing all the heavy lifting for me. I watched Vivian take a slow, deep breath, her eyes entirely bypassing the glaring evidence of theft and infidelity resting on the table. She looked at Chloe, whose performative sobbing was reaching a crescendo, and then she locked eyes with me. The hostility in her stare was absolute. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the matriarch to deliver her verdict. I knew exactly what was coming, because the golden child could never be guilty in this house, and the scapegoat could never be right. The real war was not with my cheating husband or my deceitful sister. The real war was with the woman at the head of the table who had orchestrated this toxic hierarchy from the very beginning. Vivian's palm slammed down hard against the polished mahogany wood. The crystal goblets rattled violently, the sound sharp and jarring against the dead silence of the room. She stood up, her silk blouse trembling with the force of her manufactured outrage. She did not look at the receipt sitting in the barbecue sauce. She did not look at her son-in-law sweating through his tailored shirt. She locked her furious gaze entirely on me. "Stop this foolishness right now, Maya." Vivian's voice cracked like a whip, dripping with absolute disgust. "You are making a scene over nothing. Marcus is a generous man, trying to support his family, trying to do something nice for your sister, and you sit here trying to destroy him. You are a dry accountant, Maya. You spend your entire life counting every single penny, tracking every little transaction, never letting anyone breathe. No wonder your husband feels suffocated." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. She had just looked at undeniable proof of grand larceny and infidelity, and her immediate instinctual response was to blame me for being too analytical. She was justifying his theft by weaponizing my career against me. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Suffocated, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue slowly. "A dry accountant? Is that what we are calling it now, Mother? Because from where I am sitting, this feels incredibly familiar. In fact, this feels exactly like the summer I turned 18. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Her jaw tightened defensively. "I do not know what you are talking about." "I think you do," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced everyone at the table to lean in. "Let us talk about my dry, calculating nature. Let us talk about why I had to become so obsessed with counting pennies in the first place. Do you remember the envelope that arrived in the mail from Spelman College? The thick, crisp envelope offering me a full-ride academic scholarship to one of the most prestigious historically black colleges in the country. I earned that. I worked late into the night, maintaining a perfect grade point average, volunteering, building a resume that was completely flawless. I was so proud I could barely breathe. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over Chloe, who suddenly looked very interested in the napkin resting on her lap. "But you did not celebrate, Mom." I continued, locking my eyes back onto Vivian. "You pulled me into the kitchen away from the rest of the family and you cried. You told me Chloe was struggling. You said her grades were not good enough for a scholarship, but she desperately wanted to go to an expensive out-of-state art program. You told me that if I took the Spelman scholarship, the family college fund would be split, and Chloe would not have enough to cover her tuition and her housing. You said I was strong. You said I was resilient. You said I could handle taking out student loans for a local state school, but Chloe was delicate. She needed the entire family fund. You literally told me that Chloe needed a better launching pad." The dining room was so quiet you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Vivian's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "That was a family decision." Vivian snapped, her voice losing some of its previous authority. "We had to allocate resources where they were needed most. You were always going to be fine. You did not need the extra help. I gave up my dream." I said, my words striking like physical blows. "I declined a full-ride scholarship to an elite HBCU. I drowned myself in $80,000 of student debt. I worked 2 jobs, waiting tables and balancing books, while taking a full course load, counting every single penny just to survive, so that my delicate younger sister could take the entire family college fund and spend 4 years partying at an out-of-state university. I sacrificed my financial freedom to build her launching pad. And what did she do with it? She dropped out in her 3rd year to open a failed boutique, and you bailed her out again." Chloe opened her mouth to protest, but I raised one finger, silencing her instantly. "Do not speak, Chloe. I am not finished." I turned back to my mother. "You taught her that my resources belong to her. You conditioned this entire family to believe that my hard work, my sacrifices, and my money are just a communal safety net waiting to be raided whenever your golden child makes a mistake. You sacrificed my future to fund her lifestyle back then. And now you are sitting here defending a man who literally stole my inheritance, the money my grandfather left me, to buy her a diamond necklace. You are blaming my personality for his theft. The dynamic has not changed at all, Mother. The only difference is that this time taking my money is a federal crime." Vivian's mouth opened and closed. For the first time in her life, the great matriarch of the family had run out of elegant excuses. The ugly, unvarnished truth of her blatant favoritism had been laid bare in front of the very son-in-law she was desperately trying to impress. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. Maya, you are digging up ancient history. What happened with your college fund has absolutely nothing to do with today. I told you the necklace was a business expense, a gift. You are spiraling and making this personal when it is purely professional. I turned my head slowly, fixing Marcus with a stare so cold it could have frozen boiling water. A business expense. I smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression that made him press his back firmly against his dining chair. Do you really want to talk about your business expenses, Marcus? Because as a dry accountant, I have spent the last 72 hours analyzing every single professional transaction you have made. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. The arrogant facade was cracking piece by piece, exposing the panicked fraud underneath. He had expected the old Maya, the Maya who took the hits, the Maya who absorbed the debt, the Maya who sacrificed her Spelman scholarship to keep the peace at the Sunday dinner table. He had severely underestimated the woman I had become. Vivian crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to back down. You are ruining this family dinner, Maya. You come in here with your wild accusations and your bitter resentment over the past, trying to destroy your sister and your husband. If you hate us so much, why are you even here? I am here, I said, leaning forward and placing both hands firmly on the table, because I wanted to look you in the eye when the reality of your precious launching pad finally crashes straight into the ground. I wanted to see your face when you realize that the daughter you treated like a workhorse is the only one holding the keys to the slaughterhouse. The tension in the room was absolute. Chloe was silently weeping, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks. She reached out, trying to grab her husband's hand for support. But Trenton, who had been sitting with a smug smirk just moments before, was now staring at Marcus with an expression of dawning horror. The wealthy, arrogant trust fund heir was slowly realizing that the multi-million-dollar commercial real estate project he had partnered on with my husband might be tied to the very same frozen accounts and fraudulent activities I was currently exposing. The dominoes were lined up perfectly. The golden child was crying. The deceptive husband was sweating. The biased mother was grasping for control she had already lost. And I was just getting started. The scrape of a heavy wooden chair pushing back against the hardwood floor shattered the silence. It was a harsh, grating sound that drew every eye at the table away from my sweating husband and my sobbing sister. Trenton leaned back, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored shirt. He was 36 years old, born with a silver spoon so far down his throat he had never had to chew a single meal in his life. He was a white trust fund heir who had married into our family 2 years ago, immediately bonding with Marcus over their shared love of luxury golf courses, expensive scotch, and taking absolute credit for the hard work of other people. From the day I met him, Trenton had treated me with a distinct flavor of condescension. To him, I was just the boring, overly serious sister who actually had to clock in at a desk job to pay her bills. He viewed my career as a tedious blue-collar obligation, something beneath his elevated social strata. Now, watching his wife cry fake tears and his business partner squirm under my interrogation, Trenton decided it was time to step in and save the day. He clearly thought he was dealing with an emotional, irrational woman who simply did not understand how big money operated. He let out a loud, patronizing sigh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. He reached for his crystal glass, took a slow sip of his bourbon, and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Come on," Maya, Trenton drawled, a smug smirk stretching across his face. "Marcus is my business partner. We just closed a $1 million real estate deal. A few tens of thousands of dollars is pocket change. Do not bring that cheap, low-income jealousy here and embarrass the family." The sheer audacity of the insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. In my mother's own dining room, a man who had never earned a single paycheck on his own merit had just looked me in the eye and called my outrage over an $85,000 theft cheap and low income. He had dismissed the hard-earned money of my late grandfather as pocket change. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare. Instead, a genuine, terrifying smile began to form on my lips. If Trenton had remained silent, he might have survived the impending federal bloodbath as a collateral victim. But his massive inflated ego simply would not allow him to stay out of the spotlight. By openly declaring his business partnership with Marcus right here at this table in front of multiple witnesses, he was not just defending his friend, he was legally tying himself to a massive financial fraud. He was wrapping the federal indictment rope right around his own neck completely voluntarily. I tilted my head, looking at him with mild amusement. $1 million real estate deal, I repeated, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. That sounds incredibly impressive, Trenton. You two must be working so very hard. Trenton scoffed clearly, taking my calm demeanor as a sign of submission. He thought he had successfully put me in my place. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, mansplaining finance to a federal forensic investigator. It is high-level commercial development, Maya Trenton said, his tone dripping with condescension. It requires liquid capital and aggressive networking. Marcus is out there hustling every single day to build a legacy. When you operate at our level, moving funds around to maintain relationships is just part of the game. That necklace for Chloe was an investment in a family business launch. But you would not understand that, would you? You are too busy auditing tax returns for a government salary to grasp how real wealth is generated. I shifted my gaze to Marcus. My husband looked like he was about to pass out. Unlike Trenton, Marcus knew exactly how sharp I was. Marcus knew that $85,000 was not pocket change because Marcus knew the $1 million real estate deal was completely non-existent. Marcus knew that Trenton was currently bragging about a ghost project, an elaborate illusion built on borrowed time and stolen funds. Marcus opened his mouth, desperately trying to cut Trenton off, before the idiot dug their grave any deeper. "Trenton, that is enough," Marcus stammered, holding up a shaking hand. "Let us not discuss company business at the dinner table. Maya is just upset. I can handle this." But Trenton waved him off dismissively. "No. Mark, let us discuss it. Your wife needs a reality check. She comes in here interrupting a beautiful Sunday dinner, throwing receipts on your food and acting like she caught you committing the crime of the century. She is embarrassing herself." Trenton turned his arrogant gaze back to me. "You are jealous, Maya. You have always been jealous of Chloe. Chloe has an eye for art. Chloe takes risks. You just play it safe, crunching your little numbers, resenting the fact that Marcus is a visionary who knows how to reward success. You need to apologize to your husband and your sister. Sit down and try to act like a supportive partner for once in your life." I let his words wash over me. Cheap, low income, jealous. Every insult was a beautifully wrapped gift. Every arrogant syllable was just another piece of evidence I would hand over to the prosecuting attorney. I looked over at my mother. I expected her to at least say something about Trenton's blatant disrespect toward her eldest daughter. But Vivian simply nodded along, sipping her wine, looking incredibly validated by Trenton's speech. "Trenton is absolutely right," Vivian said, her voice firm and authoritative. "You have no concept of how the real business world works, Maya. You see a large number on a piece of paper, and you immediately assume the absolute worst about your own husband. You let your insecurities cloud your judgment. You owe Marcus a massive apology. He is out there securing the future of this family alongside Trenton, and you are acting like a bitter, ungrateful woman." I looked around the table. Chloe was wiping away her fake tears, looking comforted by the fact that her wealthy husband and biased mother had successfully turned the tables. Marcus was trying to control his breathing, still terrified, but clearly hoping that Trenton's aggressive smokescreen might actually work. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. They had taken undisputed documented proof of an $85,000 theft, proof of an affair, proof of a massive financial breach of trust, and within 5 minutes, they had collectively reframed it as my personal failure. They had turned my legitimate outrage into a symptom of low-class jealousy. I picked up my glass of sweet tea, taking another slow sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. The entire table watched me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to start crying. They expected me to shout, to storm out of the house, to surrender exactly the way I had surrendered my college scholarship years ago. Instead, I set the glass down gently. I looked at Trenton, my expression devoid of any anger. "You are right about one thing, Trenton," I said, my voice eerily calm and conversational. "I do count pennies. It is a terrible habit of mine. I count them, I track them. I trace their routing numbers and I follow them through offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent wire transfers. I trace them all the way from my joint savings account straight to the neck of your weeping wife." Trenton's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny glitch in his arrogant armor. I turned my eyes back to Marcus, who was now gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles were completely white. "And you are right too, Mom," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "I clearly do not understand how real wealth is generated in this family. Because up until 48 hours ago, I was under the ridiculous impression that wealth was earned. I did not realize that securing the future of this family meant Marcus was draining personal inheritance funds to keep his mistress dripping in rubies while lying to his business partner about million-dollar commercial developments." Trenton's brow furrowed deeply. He looked at Marcus, confusion finally cutting through his thick layer of unearned confidence. "What is she talking about, Mark? What inheritance funds?" Marcus swallowed hard, looking like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. "Maya, please. You are acting crazy. Stop talking." But the shift in the room was palpable. Trenton had stepped in to put the jealous low-income sister in her place. He had stepped in to protect his business partner. But he had just inadvertently handed Marcus a microphone and demanded he explain the missing money. By intervening, the outsider had not extinguished the flame. He had poured a gallon of gasoline directly onto a roaring fire, and the heat was finally starting to singe his own tailored sleeves. Marcus heard the dangerous shift in Trenton's tone. He saw the exact second Trenton's arrogant, impenetrable ego cracked to let in a sliver of genuine confusion. If Trenton kept asking questions about the inheritance funds, it would take him less than 60 seconds to connect the delivery address of a romantic ruby necklace directly to his own weeping wife. Marcus needed a distraction, and he needed it to be catastrophic enough to suck the oxygen right back out of the room. Marcus stood up so violently that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward, crashing onto the hardwood floor. He ignored it. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his movements deliberately slow and exaggerated, projecting the false image of a deeply exhausted, long-suffering man who had finally reached his absolute breaking point. He looked down at me, shaking his head with a perfectly manufactured expression of pity and profound disgust. "I really tried, Maya, Marcus," said his voice dropping into a somber, theatrical register. "I tried to be patient with your paranoia. I tried to love you through your constant suffocating need to control every single aspect of our lives. I came here today hoping we could just have one peaceful Sunday dinner with your family. But you could not even do that. You had to fabricate this insane, jealous delusion and try to destroy my reputation in front of the people I respect the most." He turned away from the table and marched over to the entryway credenza where he had dropped his designer leather briefcase upon arriving. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoing through the silent dining room sounded like a weapon being cocked. I watched him reach inside my analytical mind, humming with absolute clarity. He was pivoting. It was a classic cornered fraudster tactic. When the numbers expose your lies, attack the credibility of the auditor. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and walked back to the dining table. "I did not want to do this here." Marcus lied smoothly, his eyes scanning the room to ensure my mother and Trenton were absorbing his performance. "I wanted to handle this privately with dignity, but since you have decided to act completely unhinged and hurl wild accusations at me and your own sister, you leave me no choice. You have shown everyone exactly who you are today, Maya. Unstable, bitter, and completely disconnected from reality." He slammed the thick stack of legal documents onto the table right next to the barbecue-stained Cartier receipt. A few drops of spilled sweet tea splashed against the crisp white margins. The document on top was a petition for dissolution of marriage. I did not need to read the fine print to know what it was. What caught my attention was the bottom of the front page. Marcus had already signed it. The ink was dark blue, his signature executed with his usual arrogant sweeping flourish. It had been signed and notarized on Friday. He had spent the entire weekend kissing my forehead, calling me beautiful, and playing the devoted husband while carrying pre-signed divorce papers in his briefcase. But Marcus was not finished. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a second stack of papers, slapping them down right on top of the divorce petition. "This is an ex parte asset freeze court order," Marcus announced, puffing his chest out as he regained his footing. He shot a grateful look over at Trenton. "I have to thank Trenton for this. When I confided in him last week about your increasingly erratic behavior and your threats to ruin my business, he was gracious enough to put me in touch with his family's corporate legal team. They are absolute sharks, Maya. They went before a judge on Friday afternoon and secured an emergency injunction. As of this morning, you are legally barred from moving, hiding, or transferring any assets associated with our marriage." Trenton immediately straightened up in his chair, his confusion about the inheritance funds instantly vanishing. His massive ego simply could not resist taking credit for a ruthless legal maneuver. He smoothed his tie, looking incredibly proud of himself. Marcus had played him perfectly, stroking his vanity to blind him to the ongoing affair. "That is right," Trenton chimed in, leaning back with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "When Marcus told me you were trying to strangle his commercial real estate investments with your petty financial controlling, I made one phone call to my lead attorney. You cannot just freeze a man out of his own livelihood, Maya. The court agreed with us. You are locked out." I looked down at the injunction. It was a masterpiece of predatory legal bullying. They had filed the paperwork claiming I was an unstable spouse, preparing to liquidate marital assets out of spite. It was a standard, albeit aggressive tactic used to paralyze a victim before they even knew they were under attack. But Marcus had saved his most vicious weapon for last. He leaned over the table, planting his palms on the polished wood, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of the man I thought I had married. And regarding the housing arrangements, Marcus said, his voice dripping with venom, "My legal team has filed a motion for equitable distribution of the primary residence." I stared at him, my expression completely flat. "You mean my house? The neoclassical home I purchased entirely with my own savings, solely in my own name, 2 full years before I made the mistake of letting you put a ring on my finger." Marcus let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked over at my mother, who was nodding in agreement with him. "That is where your dry, rigid little accountant brain fails to understand the law," Maya Marcus sneered. "Georgia is an equitable distribution state. And while you may have brought that house into the marriage marital funds, and marital efforts were used to improve it, who do you think managed the contractors when we renovated the kitchen? Who designed the landscaping? As a licensed real estate broker, my professional expertise directly contributed to the appreciation of that property's market value. My lawyers have already established that the commingling of our joint funds for maintenance and my sweat equity have transformed that house into a marital asset." He tapped his index finger hard against the legal documents. "I am legally entitled to 50% of the current market equity of that house," Marcus demanded, his voice rising in absolute triumph. "Half of everything. And since I know you do not have the liquid cash to buy me out of my half, I am going to force a sale. The court will mandate that the house be put on the market by the end of the month." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his plan laid itself bare in front of me. He had orchestrated the perfect heist. He drained my grandfather's inheritance to buy diamonds for his mistress, who just so happened to be my sister. He used my brother-in-law's elite lawyers to freeze my ability to defend myself. And now he was utilizing a predatory legal loophole to steal half the value of the only sanctuary I had ever owned. He intended to throw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing, leaving me financially ruined, while he walked away with a massive payout. My mother, Vivian, let out a long, dramatic sigh of approval. She looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, as if I had brought this entire catastrophe upon myself. "You see what happens when you refuse to be a supportive wife, Maya," Vivian scolded, shaking her head. You push a good man into a corner and he has to protect himself. You have no children. You spend all your time working. You do not even need a house that large. Chloe and Trenton are actually trying to build a real family. They are preparing to welcome a baby soon, and they need the space to grow. It is incredibly selfish of you to try and hoard property you do not even use properly. You should sign those papers, give Marcus what he is owed, and walk away quietly before you humiliate this family any further. I shifted my gaze to Chloe. The fake tears had miraculously vanished from her cheeks. She was dabbing the corners of her eyes with her napkin, but her gaze was fixed squarely on the divorce petition. Beneath the performance of the fragile, bullied younger sister, I saw the undeniable, hungry gleam of greed. She was already mentally decorating the living room of my house. She was already picturing herself wearing that $85,000 ruby necklace, walking down the sweeping staircase of the home I had bled to purchase. The entire family sat there staring at me, waiting for my spirit to finally snap. They expected me to look at the staggering legal threats, the frozen bank accounts, and the united front of my blood relatives and simply surrender. They wanted me to sign away my home and my dignity just to make the nightmare stop. I looked at the divorce petition. I looked at the asset freeze. And then slowly I reached out and pushed the stack of papers a few inches to the right, creating a clear space on the table directly in front of me. My mother took my silence as a sign of submission. In her mind, she had finally broken the stubborn, defiant daughter who had always refused to fall in line. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet maternal tone that she only used when she was about to deliver the most devastating blows. "Let us be perfectly honest with each other, Maya," Vivian said softly. "You are 34 years old. You work 80 hours a week chasing paper trails for the government. You have made it abundantly clear that your career is your only child. What exactly do you intend to do with a 5-bedroom neoclassical estate? It is practically a museum. You walk around those empty halls completely alone while your sister is actually fulfilling her purpose." Vivian reached over and gently patted Chloe's hand. Chloe immediately placed her other hand over her lower abdomen, a gesture so profoundly theatrical it belonged on a daytime soap opera. "Chloe and Trenton are bringing a new life into this world," my mother continued, her eyes shining with absolute adoration for her golden child. "A baby needs a proper home, a yard, a safe, prestigious neighborhood. Your house is in the perfect school district. It has the perfect layout for a nursery. It is the ideal environment to raise the next generation of our family." I stared at my mother, letting the sheer magnitude of her cruelty wash over me. She was not just defending my cheating husband, she was actively brokering a deal to strip me of my sanctuary so she could hand it over to her favorite daughter. Trenton swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, nodding in agreement. He looked at me as if he were negotiating a hostile corporate takeover completely devoid of any human empathy. "It makes total financial sense," Trenton stated, his voice booming with unearned authority. "Marcus is entitled to half the equity. Chloe and I have the capital to buy out his share the second the judge forces the sale. We keep the property in the family. Marcus gets the liquid cash he needs to continue funding our commercial developments. You get a fresh start in a condo downtown, which is much more suited to a single working woman anyway. It is a win for the greater good of the entire family." I shifted my gaze to Chloe. She was looking at me with wide, pleading eyes, playing the innocent, expectant mother who just wanted a safe place for her unborn child. "I know you love that house, Maya," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with fake sincerity. "But you have to think about the baby. It is not about us anymore. We are trying to build a legacy. You could be the cool aunt who comes over for the holidays. We could host Thanksgiving in your old dining room. It would be a beautiful sacrifice." A beautiful sacrifice. The words echoed in my mind. They wanted me to fund the purchase of her necklace with my grandfather's money, and now they wanted me to hand over the deed to my home so she could raise a child inside its walls. A child that, given the timeline of Marcus buying her an $85,000 piece of jewelry, might not even belong to her arrogant trust fund husband. The web of betrayal was so thick, so deeply entangled, it was almost mathematically magnificent. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, trying to project the dominance he had entirely lost. "Stop babying her," he snapped, looking at Vivian and Trenton. "Maya is a cold-blooded machine. She does not care about your baby Chloe. She does not care about family legacy. She only cares about her spreadsheets and her bank accounts. I wasted the best years of my life trying to thaw out a woman who is completely incapable of love. I earned every single penny of that house equity for putting up with her sterile, emotionless existence. Sign the papers, Maya. Stop being so incredibly selfish." Selfish. The word was thrown at me like a javelin. I was the selfish one for not wanting to be robbed blind by my husband and my sister. I was the cold-blooded one for not weeping with joy as my mother orchestrated the theft of my real estate. Vivian shook her head, her face twisting into a mask of pure disdain. "You have always been like this, Maya. From the time you were a little girl, you never wanted to share. You never understood the concept of family duty. When you forced us to let you take those student loans instead of just handing your college fund over to Chloe gracefully, I knew you had a rotten core. Now you sit here hoarding a massive house you cannot fill, trying to destroy your husband's career out of pure spite, while your pregnant sister is just asking for a place to build her nest. You are a disappointment. You are an absolute disappointment to the blood in your veins." The gang up was spectacular. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They were attacking my femininity, my career, my character, and my future, all in one coordinated strike. They expected the crushing weight of their collective disapproval to finally snap my spine. They expected me to reach for the designer pen sitting next to the divorce petition, sign my name on the dotted line, and surrender my entire life to them just to escape the verbal firing squad. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. The blood pressure in the room was suffocating. The air was thick with their greed and their toxic entitlement. They were a pack of wolves circling what they thought was a wounded, bleeding animal. But wolves only win when the prey is actually bleeding. I did not reach for the pen. I did not apologize. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was about to completely obliterate. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. I looked at Marcus, who was sweating through his suit. I looked at Chloe, who was already imagining the color she would paint my nursery. I looked at Trenton, who was sipping his bourbon like a victorious king. And finally, I locked eyes with my mother, the architect of my lifetime of misery. I let the dead silence stretch out for 10 full seconds. I let their smug, satisfied smiles begin to falter as they realized I was not breaking, I was not bending, I was simply loading the gun. The silence in the dining room became a physical entity. It wrapped around the heavy mahogany table, pressing against the crystal goblets and settling over the cooling plates of soul food like a thick layer of frost. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a heavy metronome methodically counting down the final seconds of my previous life. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply sat there, letting the profound quiet stretch out until it became absolutely deafening. If this were a movie, the camera would be mounted on a smooth steel track, gliding at an agonizingly slow pace around the perimeter of the room. It would capture the exact anatomy of a family betrayal, framing each of their faces in vivid, unforgiving detail. The invisible lens would first pan over to Marcus. My husband sat with his shoulders squared, trying desperately to project the image of a man fully in control of his domain. He tapped his index finger rhythmically against the polished wood of the table, a nervous tick disguised as a gesture of impatience. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought the pre-signed divorce petition and the ruthless asset freeze were the ultimate checkmate. In his mind, he had successfully neutralized the threat. He had cornered the dry, predictable accountant and stripped her of her primary weapon. I watched the faint sheen of sweat cooling on his forehead, studying him not as a heartbroken wife, but as an auditor examining a fraudulent ledger. Marcus was a man who lived exclusively on borrowed margins. He borrowed against my bank accounts, he borrowed against my trust, and he borrowed against his business partner's reputation. He thought his legal paperwork was a cage designed to trap me. He had absolutely no idea that he had just locked the door from the inside, trapping himself in a sealed room with a federal predator. The imaginary camera would then slide seamlessly across the table to capture Chloe. My younger sister was a masterpiece of parasitic engineering. The fake tears had completely dried, leaving behind a perfectly powdered face that radiated entitled expectation. She rested her hands protectively over her lower abdomen, using the concept of an unborn child as a psychological shield and a weapon of mass acquisition. She wanted my house. She wanted my address, my neighborhood, and the sweeping staircase I had worked 80-hour weeks to afford. Chloe had spent her entire existence stepping on my shoulders to reach heights she never earned, constantly demanding that my sacrifices be converted into her stepping stones. She wanted the aesthetic of a successful life, without shedding a single drop of the sweat required to build it. I stared at the delicate curve of her neck, visualizing the $85,000 ruby necklace she expected to wear while hosting holiday dinners in my dining room. The irony of her demanding my sanctuary using money stolen from the grandfather who actually respected me was a deficit I was about to correct with brutal precision. The tracking shot would continue its slow, sweeping arc, landing squarely on Trenton. He sat angled toward the table, swirling the expensive bourbon in his glass, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandelier. Trenton was the arrogant outsider, the wealthy white savior who had married into our family and immediately deemed himself the undisputed king of the table. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and profound disdain. To Trenton, I was just a blue-collar worker, a low-income civilian, throwing a tantrum in the presence of true commercial titans. He believed his family lawyers had crushed me with a single phone call. He was so blinded by his own generational privilege that he could not see the massive liability he had just assumed. By intervening by officially tying his multi-million-dollar real estate empire to my husband's fraudulent activities right in front of federal law enforcement, he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear launch. I cataloged his smug, self-satisfied smirk. I mapped out his vulnerabilities. Trenton was a loose thread hanging from a very expensive suit, and I was preparing to pull that thread until his entire empire unraveled into a pile of useless fabric. Finally, the lens would complete its rotation, centering directly on the matriarch. Vivian sat tall and rigid at the head of the table, wearing her pearls like a crown of absolute authority. She was the grand architect of my misery. She was the one who had built this toxic hierarchy brick by brick, lie by lie, demanding constant tribute from the scapegoat to endlessly feed the golden child. I looked at the righteous indignation painted across her sharp features. She felt zero remorse for orchestrating the theft of my property. In her twisted logic, she was simply redistributing family resources to restore the natural order of her kingdom. I internalized every single slight, every dismissive comment, every time she chose Chloe's comfort over my survival. I processed the memory of my surrendered college scholarship, the years of crushing debt, and the relentless emotional starvation she had subjected me to since childhood. As I sat in the dead silence absorbing the visual data of their triumphant smirks, a profound internal shift occurred within me. The searing, agonizing pain of multiple betrayals simply evaporated. The crushing weight of discovering my husband's infidelity, my sister's treachery, and my mother's complicity burned away, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated tactical fuel. I was no longer a discarded daughter. I was no longer a betrayed sister. I was no longer a discarded wife facing an aggressive asset freeze. I was a federal forensic financial investigator staring at an organized crime syndicate. I stopped viewing them as my blood relatives and started viewing them as targets on a federal indictment board. Every tear I had refused to shed converted directly into cold, calculating strategy. I was auditing their souls, and I found them entirely bankrupt. They had massive liabilities, fraudulent emotional transactions, and a complete lack of defensive reserves. They had played their hands aggressively, showing me every single weapon in their arsenal. The divorce papers, the asset freeze, the emotional manipulation, the unified front. They had emptied their magazines, firing everything they had at me, expecting me to fall. But I was still sitting there, and I was completely unharmed. The silence stretched past the 30-second mark. It stretched to a full minute. I weaponized the quiet, starving them of the hysterical reaction they desperately needed to validate their cruelty. They needed me to scream. They needed me to beg for my house. They needed me to throw a glass or hurl insults so they could call me crazy and unstable. My absolute stillness began to suffocate them. The atmosphere in the dining room slowly began to curdle. The triumphant energy morphed into a thick, creeping discomfort. Marcus was the first to show the strain. His smirk twitched and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the stiff collar of his shirt. He shifted his weight, suddenly realizing that a cornered victim is supposed to panic, not observe. Chloe dropped her hands from her stomach, the confident glow fading from her cheeks as she glanced nervously toward the heavy oak doors, as if sensing the impending atmospheric pressure drop. Trenton stopped swirling his bourbon. He set the crystal glass down on the table with a soft thud, his brow furrowing as he stared at me, trying to decipher the terrifying blankness in my eyes. Even Vivian lost a fraction of her imperial posture. She opened her mouth to issue another reprimand to demand that I sign the papers and leave her house, but the words died in her throat. She looked at me, and for the very first time in her life, she did not see a daughter she could control. She saw a predator patiently waiting for the trap to spring shut. They had meticulously orchestrated a hostile takeover of my life. They had successfully cornered the accountant. They simply did not realize that the accountant had already seized control of the entire bank. I finally broke the silence. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a slow, razor-sharp smirk. I reached out and placed my fingertips against the thick stack of legal documents Marcus had so triumphantly slammed down in front of me. With a single fluid motion, I pushed the pre-signed divorce petition and the local asset freeze order across the polished mahogany table. The heavy paper slid away from me, coming to a halt right next to the barbecue-stained jewelry receipt. I completely rejected his entire legal strategy with a simple flick of my wrist. My mother opened her mouth to scold me for my defiance, but I did not even look at her. I reached down into my leather handbag and pulled out my iPad Pro. I set it gently on the table and tapped the screen. The device illuminated the dining room, casting a cool blue light across my face. I typed in my passcode with rhythmic, deliberate taps. The quiet clicking of the digital keyboard was the only sound in the room. Everyone watched me in a state of suspended animation, entirely unsure of what I was doing, but suddenly terrified by the absolute certainty radiating from my posture. "You know, Marcus," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on my glowing screen, "I actually have to commend you." The ex parte asset freeze was a very aggressive opening move. You went to a local family court judge on a Friday afternoon, cried about an unstable wife, and managed to secure a temporary injunction to lock me out of our shared domestic accounts. You thought you were being incredibly strategic. You thought you had completely paralyzed me before I even knew we were at war. I looked up from the iPad, locking my gaze directly onto his sweating face. But that is the fundamental problem with you, Marcus. You think entirely too small. You brought a local civil court injunction to a federal financial audit, and I am about to show you exactly why that was the worst mistake of your entire life. I turned the iPad around and pushed it across the table so it rested directly in front of him. The screen displayed a secure banking dashboard. It was not our local credit union. It was the high-net-worth corporate banking portal where Marcus managed every single aspect of his commercial real estate brokerage. When the store manager at Cartier brought me into the VIP room to verify the $85,000 charge, I did not just ask for a printed receipt. I explained, my voice gliding through the dining room with lethal calmness. I picked up my phone and called the bank's dedicated fraud division. I informed them that my husband had stolen a massive sum of inherited funds to make an unauthorized purchase. But I did not stop there, Marcus, because I know exactly how you operate. I know that you run your finances like a sloppy shell game. You used a business line of credit connected to our joint savings to temporarily float the purchase of Chloe's necklace, assuming you could quickly pay it down when your next commission cleared. You commingled our personal marital assets with your corporate brokerage accounts. Marcus's chest stopped moving. He stared at my iPad screen, but he was so frozen with panic he could not even bring himself to touch it. Do you know what happens in the federal banking system when an authorized signer flags an $85,000 transaction as grand larceny and identity theft on a commingled corporate account? I asked, leaning forward slightly. The system does not just freeze the single credit card you used at the jewelry store. The algorithms are programmed to recognize the immediate risk of capital flight. They look at the rapid movement of stolen funds across business channels, and they trigger a mandatory automatic compliance protocol under anti-money laundering regulations. I watched the color completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. They did not just freeze our joint savings account, Marcus. I delivered the killing blow, my voice ringing with absolute authority. They froze everything. Your primary business checking account, your corporate lines of credit, the escrow accounts holding the earnest money for your clients, your payroll accounts. Every single routing number attached to your social security number and your business tax identification number has been placed under a total federally mandated compliance lock. That is impossible. Marcus choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched rasp. You cannot do that. The bank would have notified me. Check your phone, Marcus, I commanded, pointing at the device resting in his suit pocket. The compliance division initiates the freeze before they issue the notification to prevent the suspect from transferring funds offshore. The automated emails should have hit your inbox about 45 minutes ago, right around the time you were piling my mother's barbecue ribs onto your plate and pretending to be the perfect husband. Marcus frantically reached into his breast pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped his expensive smartphone onto the floor. He fumbled with the facial recognition, his breathing shallow and rapid. Chloe leaned over, trying to look at his screen, her eyes wide with a brand new, terrifying kind of panic. The golden child was suddenly realizing that the man she had been sleeping with might not be the wealthy savior she thought he was. Marcus opened his email application. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what he was looking at. I had seen the exact same automated federal compliance banners 1,000 times in my career. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the screen, reading the subject lines. His mouth opened in a silent gasp. He tapped desperately on one of the emails, scrolling down with a trembling thumb. Then he quickly switched to his banking application. He typed in his password, his finger slipping twice before he got it right. The application loaded, and a bright red warning banner immediately flashed across his entire screen. Account restricted. Please contact the Fraud and Compliance Department immediately. He swiped to the next account. Restricted. He swiped to his business line of credit. Restricted. Every single account balance showed a terrifying zero available balance. He was entirely locked out of his own life. No, 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 this cannot be happening, Marcus muttered to himself, his voice sounding completely unhinged. I have contractors to pay on Tuesday. I have a closing on Thursday. The earnest money is in that escrow account. If I miss that closing, they will sue me for breach of contract. I will lose my broker license. Maya, you have to call them. You have to call them right now and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was a marital dispute. You cannot do this to my business. I sat back in my chair, crossing my legs elegantly. Call them and say what exactly? That you did not commit wire fraud. That you did not steal $85,000 of my grandfather's money to buy rubies for my sister. That would be lying to a federal financial institution, Marcus. As a government investigator, I could lose my badge and face criminal charges for making a false statement to a bank. I am afraid I cannot help you. You are currently the subject of an active money laundering investigation. You are completely financially neutralized. You cannot buy a house. You cannot pay a contractor. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee on your way to the unemployment office. My mother, Vivian, was staring at Marcus with absolute horror. The wealthy, successful son-in-law she had been bragging about to her friends was currently having a mental breakdown over his frozen assets. The illusion of his prosperity had been shattered in an instant. He was not a commercial real estate titan. He was a broke, desperate man begging his wife to save him from federal ruin. But as Marcus sat there hyperventilating over his phone, I shifted my attention to the other end of the table. I watched Trenton. Trenton was no longer sipping his bourbon. He had placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. He was staring at Marcus, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating the massive, catastrophic collateral damage of what I had just revealed. Trenton had just spent the last 10 minutes bragging about $1 million commercial real estate project he was partnering on with Marcus. He had mocked my income while boasting about the aggressive networking and liquid capital required to operate at their elite level. And now the realization was washing over him like a tidal wave of ice water. If Marcus had been using commingled corporate accounts to run his business, and Trenton had wired his own trust fund capital into Marcus's business accounts to fund their joint real estate venture, then Trenton's money was trapped inside the exact same frozen accounts. The federal compliance lock did not care whose money it was. It froze everything the suspect touched. Trenton swallowed hard, the color draining from his usually flushed, confident face. He looked at Marcus, and the camaraderie they had shared just moments before completely vanished, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a wealthy man realizing his money had just been seized by the government. The realization struck Trenton with the force of a freight train. The smug, aristocratic ease that had defined his entire existence vanished in an instant, replaced by a violent, unhinged panic. He had just wired a massive sum of his trust fund capital directly into Marcuse's corporate accounts to secure their supposed commercial real estate venture. And I had just triggered a federal compliance lock that froze every single asset Marcus had access to. Trenton's money was trapped in a financial quarantine zone, and the key had just been thrown into a federal incinerator. Trenton pushed his heavy wooden chair back so aggressively it screeches against the polished floorboards, tipping backward and slamming into the antique credenza behind him. He did not care. He lunged forward, planting both of his fists onto the mahogany dining table with a force that made the fine china rattle and my mother's crystal wine glasses vibrate. His face flushed a dark mottled crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive tailored collar. The composed, wealthy savior was gone, revealing the volatile, entitled brat underneath. "You undo it!" Trenton roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room. "You pick up your phone right now, Maya, and you call your little bank manager, and you reverse that freeze. You have absolutely no idea what you have just done. You are playing dangerous, stupid games with real capital. My capital." I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I held his furious gaze with a look of mild, clinical curiosity. I watched a man who had never been told no in his entire life completely malfunction. Trenton slammed his fist on the table again, spittle flying from his lips. "Are you deaf? I told you to reverse it. You are a bitter, jealous woman throwing a tantrum because your husband bought a necklace for someone else. You do not get to hold my commercial investments hostage over a domestic dispute. Do you know who my family is? Do you have any concept of the legal firepower I have on retainer?" My mother, Vivian, immediately sensed the shift in power. Seeing Trenton enraged gave her a renewed surge of desperate confidence. She pointed a trembling finger at me from the head of the table. "You listen to him!" Maya Vivian demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "You have gone entirely too far. You are letting your emotions destroy this family. Trenton will ruin you. His family owns half the judges in this city. You are going to end up bankrupt and in jail for corporate sabotage, all because you could not handle your own marriage. Unlock those accounts right now and apologize to this man." Chloe nodded vigorously, drying her fake tears, looking at Trenton like he was a conquering hero, preparing to slay a dragon. She genuinely believed her wealthy husband was about to bully me into submission. But Marcus was not nodding. Marcus was staring at me with a look of absolute sickening terror. Unlike Trenton and my mother, Marcus had actually lived with me. He had watched me work. He had seen my meticulous nature. And looking at my completely unfazed expression, Marcus suddenly realized that a normal accountant would be terrified by a billionaire's threat of litigation. A normal accountant would be scrambling for her phone to undo the damage. I was doing neither. I was just letting Trenton dig his own grave. "I own you," Trenton sneered, leaning over the table until his face was inches from mine. I will call my father's legal team right now. We will file charges for tortious interference, malicious prosecution, and corporate espionage. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the next decade. I will take this house, I will take your savings, and I will make sure you never work in the financial sector again. We will bury you so deep in legal fees, you will be begging to clean floors to pay off your debt. I will personally see to it that you are locked in a jail cell for filing a false fraud report. Trenton stopped shouting, breathing heavily through his nose, waiting for the threats to take effect. He waited for me to crumble, to cry, to reach for my phone in a blind panic. I let his echo fade completely from the room. I picked up my linen napkin, delicately dabbed the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. "You are going to lock me in a jail cell," I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, melodic whisper that commanded the entire room. "You are going to use your daddy's country club lawyers to sue me for tortious interference." That is a very impressive vocabulary, Trenton. It really is. It sounds exactly like a man who memorized a few legal buzzwords from television shows, but has absolutely zero understanding of how federal jurisdiction actually operates. Trenton's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" I looked at my mother, then at Marcus, and finally back to Trenton. "You all keep calling me a dry accountant, a boring number cruncher. Marcus, you spent the last 5 years telling your friends I balance spreadsheets for a mid-level government agency. You never once bothered to ask about the specifics of my caseload because my career was just background noise to your massive inflated ego. You assumed I was a civilian pencil pusher." I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out my phone to reverse the freeze. I pulled out a heavy, solid black leather wallet. I tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, heavy metallic thud, slapping down right on top of Marcus's pre-signed divorce petition and the asset freeze order. The leather flipped open upon impact. The dining room chandelier cast a brilliant, blinding glare over the solid gold shield embedded in the leather. The federal eagle gleamed under the light. Opposite the heavy metal badge was my official government identification card, featuring my stern photograph and my unredacted official title, printed in bold, undeniable black ink. Trenton stared at the leather wallet. His mouth fell slightly open. The color completely drained from his furious face, leaving him looking like a chalk statue. "I do not do taxes, Trenton," I stated, my voice ringing with the cold, absolute authority of the United States government. "I do not balance corporate checkbooks, and I certainly do not care about your daddy's country club lawyers. I am a federal forensic financial investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. My division does not audit minor discrepancies. We dismantle international money laundering syndicates. We track terrorist funding networks. We seize the assets of organized crime families. We build the financial cages that put arrogant, sloppy white-collar criminals into federal penitentiaries for decades." Marcus let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. He slumped back into his chair, pressing his hands over his face, finally comprehending the apocalyptic scale of his mistake. He had stolen money from a federal investigator. He had brought his illicit financial network right into the living room of the person trained to destroy it. I stood up slowly, bracing my hands on the table, leaning in to mirror Trenton's aggressive posture. But unlike him, I had the entire weight of the federal justice system standing right behind me. "So let us review what just happened here, Trenton." I continued, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. "I initiated a mandatory compliance lock on a suspect account connected to grand larceny and potential money laundering. And your immediate response was to stand up, lean over my table, and aggressively threaten to destroy my life, my finances, and my freedom if I did not reverse an active federal freeze." Trenton swallowed hard. He tried to take a step back, but his legs seemed glued to the floor. "Do you know what the Department of Justice calls that, Trenton?" I asked, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "It is not called tortious interference. It is called obstruction of justice. It is called the intimidation of a federal official during an active financial investigation. That is a federal felony, Trenton. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence. Your father's overpriced lawyers cannot save you in a federal courtroom. They cannot bribe a federal judge, and they certainly cannot unfreeze the money you willingly wired into a compromised account. Chloe let out a high-pitched sob, pressing her hands against her mouth in absolute horror. The protective bubble of her wealthy husband had just been popped with a single brutal strike. My mother Vivian was completely paralyzed. The woman who had spent the entire dinner mocking my career, calling me a low-income disappointment, was staring at the gleaming gold badge on the table as if it were a venomous snake. She had spent her entire life worshipping the illusion of wealth, completely blind to the fact that her eldest daughter commanded the power to seize it all. I looked at Trenton, who was now trembling visibly, his arrogant facade entirely pulverized by the crushing reality of federal law. "Would you like to repeat your threats, Trenton?" I asked pleasantly, gesturing toward my phone. "I can start an audio recording right now. I would be more than happy to add a charge of federal intimidation to the upcoming indictment. Go ahead. Tell me exactly how you are going to bury me." Trenton did not speak. He could not speak. The rich, untouchable air was completely suffocated by the dead silence he had just created. I let Trenton marinate in his own paralyzing terror for exactly 10 seconds. Then I reached back into my leather handbag. I bypassed my phone and my wallet. My fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy spine of a dark blue binder. I pulled it out and dropped it squarely onto the center of the dining table. It landed with a dense, authoritative thud that made the crystal wine glasses rattle all over again. "I have not slept a single minute in the last 72 hours, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute clarity. "While you two were out at the country club celebrating your phantom real estate closings and shopping for blood rubies, I was sitting in a secure federal facility, drinking black coffee and tearing apart your entire financial existence." I flipped open the heavy cover of the binder. The pages inside were densely packed with spreadsheets, wire transfer logs, and corporate registration documents, all heavily highlighted in neon yellow and red ink. It was the visual representation of their total destruction. "You see, Marcus?" I continued, tracing a manicured fingernail down the first column of numbers. "You made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman you married. You thought a forensic accountant just looked at tax deductions, but my specialty is piercing the corporate veil. When I saw that $85,000 charge, I did not just look at our joint savings. I pulled the thread. And once I started pulling, your entire cheap, poorly constructed suit completely unraveled." I flipped to a tab marked with a red sticky note. I looked directly at Trenton, who was practically hyperventilating, his eyes glued to the documents. "Let us talk about this brilliant commercial real estate venture, Trenton. The one you were just bragging about to my mother. The one you claimed required so much aggressive networking and liquid capital." I tapped the page. "You and Marcus established a series of shell companies over the last 14 months. Apex Holdings, Summit Development, and Vanguard Equities. You layered them beautifully, establishing LLCs inside of other LLCs to hide the primary beneficiaries. You used those fake companies to funnel investor capital out of legitimate escrow accounts and directly into offshore private wealth funds." Trenton's jaw trembled. He looked violently ill. "You were not building commercial real estate?" I said, my tone sharpening into a blade. "You were siphoning assets. You took earnest money from your clients, Marcus, and instead of holding it in secure trust accounts, you wired it straight to Trenton's holding companies. Then Trenton washed the money through his trust fund channels and kicked it back out as clean, untraceable cash to fund your lavish lifestyles. It is a textbook laundering operation, and it is incredibly sloppy." Marcus buried his face in his hands, letting out a muffled, pathetic groan. He knew it was over. The physical evidence was sitting right in front of him, printed on government watermarked paper. But the most fascinating part of my 72-hour audit was not the stolen money, I noted, turning my attention away from the two criminals and focusing entirely on the golden child sitting across from me. It was the legal structuring of your little criminal syndicate. I flipped the binder to a section labeled with a bright orange tab. I pulled out a stapled packet of legal documents and slid them across the mahogany table. They came to a halt right in front of Chloe's plate. Chloe stared at the papers as if they were covered in poison. Her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths. "Pick it up, Chloe," I commanded. She did not move. She looked at our mother for help, but Vivian was completely immobilized by shock. her eyes darting between the federal badge and the binder of evidence. I said, "Pick it up." My voice cracked like a whip, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Chloe's trembling fingers reached out and grasped the edge of the packet. She pulled it toward her, looking down at the dense legal jargon. "Read the name of the primary registered agent for Apex Holdings," I instructed. "Read the name of the sole legal signatory for the company that just received $3 million in stolen, laundered federal wire transfers." Chloe stared at the paper, her eyes widened to the size of saucers. Her mouth fell open in a silent, horrified scream. "It is my name," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with absolute terror. "Why is my name on this?" I smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. "Because your husband and your lover are cowards, Chloe. They wanted to play the roles of wealthy, untouchable kingpins, but they were absolutely terrified of the liability. They knew that if the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FBI ever audited their fake real estate deals, the first person the feds would look for is the registered agent who signed the corporate charters." I leaned forward, making sure she absorbed every single word. "They set you up to be the fall guy. They needed a useful idiot, someone gullible enough to sign massive stacks of legal paperwork without ever reading the fine print. Trenton told you he was making you a partner in his business, did he not? He brought you a stack of documents, told you to sign on the dotted line, and promised you it was just a formality to secure your future." Chloe's head snapped toward Trenton, a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal washing over her face. "Trenton, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not do this." Trenton could not even look at his wife. He stared at the floor, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. His silence was the loudest, most damning confession in the room. I shifted my gaze to Marcus, who was still hiding behind his hands. "And you, Marcus, you went right along with it. You let your wealthy business partner use your mistress as a human meat shield. That $85,000 ruby necklace was not a congratulatory gift for opening an art gallery. It was hush money. It was a shiny, expensive distraction designed to keep her smiling, compliant, and completely oblivious to the fact that you two were actively framing her for a multi-million-dollar federal felony." The illusion of their unified front completely shattered. The toxic alliance that had been weaponized against me for years instantly collapsed under the crushing weight of their own treachery. Chloe let out a visceral, agonizing scream. She grabbed her water glass and hurled it directly at Trenton's head. He ducked, and the crystal shattered violently against the dining room wall, sending water and shards of glass raining down onto the expensive Persian rug. "You set me up!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat. "You put my name on a laundering operation. I am pregnant. I am carrying your child, and you set me up to go to federal prison so you could protect your trust fund." Trenton finally looked up, his arrogance completely replaced by desperate, cornered malice. "Oh, shut up, Chloe. You loved the money. You loved the designer bags and the luxury apartment and the art gallery I paid for. You never once asked where the capital came from as long as your credit cards kept clearing. You are just as complicit as we are." My mother, Vivian, let out a horrified gasp, clutching her pearls as she watched her perfect, wealthy son-in-law viciously turn on her precious golden child. The flawless, untouchable family image she had curated for decades was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. "Marcus, tell them it is not true," Vivian pleaded, her voice trembling with absolute desperation. "Tell them you did not put Chloe in danger. You love this family." Marcus finally lowered his hands from his face. He looked at Vivian with eyes that were hollow dead and entirely defeated. He did not say a word to defend himself. He just stared at the barbecue-stained receipt on his plate, fully comprehending that his entire life was over. I sat back in my chair, perfectly composed, watching the chaos unfold. They were tearing each other apart. The wolves had realized they were trapped in a cage, and instead of fighting the predator, they had immediately turned their fangs on each other. I tapped my fingernail against the cover of the blue binder, drawing their panicked attention back to the true source of their destruction. "You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary." "Chloe," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. "As the registered agent, you are legally responsible for every single fraudulent wire transfer that passed through those shell companies." The Department of Justice does not care if you were too busy shopping to read the incorporation documents. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense for money laundering. Chloe collapsed forward onto the table, burying her face in her arms, weeping with a chaotic, unrestrained terror that shook her entire body. The golden child was finally experiencing the absolute crushing consequences of the real world. And as for you two, I said, shifting my gaze between Marcus and Trenton, I have handed over every single page of this dossier to the federal prosecutor overseeing financial crimes in this district. You are not just facing embezzlement charges. You are facing conspiracy, wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. Your assets are frozen. Your passports have been flagged. There is absolutely nowhere for you to run. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. It was the suffocating quiet of predators realizing they had just walked blindly into a steel trap. But the financial execution was only half of the reckoning. I had completely dismantled their personal greed, yet I had not even touched upon the sheer, unforgivable depravity of how they actually generated their stolen capital. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I stopped directly behind my husband. I placed my hands on the high back of his chair, leaning down just enough so my voice would carry directly past his ear. Do you want to know the absolute worst part about my 72-hour investigation, Marcus? I asked, my tone dropping to a chillingly calm register. It was not discovering your affair with my sister. It was not finding out you stole my grandfather's inheritance to buy her diamonds. Those are just standard, pathetic acts of a weak man. The absolute worst part was reading the victim manifest of your fake real estate empire. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. A violent tremor ran through his shoulders. He knew exactly what was coming next, and he was completely powerless to stop it. I stepped away from his chair and walked toward the center of the room so I could look my mother and Trenton directly in the eyes. Trenton loves to brag about his million-dollar commercial development deals. I continued, my voice echoing with righteous, calculated fury. He loves to act like a visionary building the future of Atlanta. But there are no commercial buildings. There are no development permits. There is absolutely no construction happening anywhere. The entire operation is a classic predatory Ponzi scheme. You took money from new investors to pay fake dividends to early investors, siphoning the massive difference directly into offshore accounts. Trenton scoffed, a desperate, hollow sound. He tried to adjust his posture to project confidence, but his hands were trembling too violently. Businesses fail all the time. Maya Trenton stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. Investments carry risk. The market shifted. We simply over-leveraged our capital during a downturn. That is not a crime. It is a civil dispute. You are trying to criminalize standard real estate losses because you are bitter about a necklace. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A civil dispute. That is a fascinating legal defense, Trenton. I am sure your overpriced attorneys will love presenting that argument to a federal judge. But you are forgetting one massive, glaring detail. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not view predatory targeting as a simple market fluctuation. I turned my gaze exclusively to my mother. Vivian was sitting rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of absolute horror. Mom, do you want to know exactly who funded your golden child's luxury lifestyle? I asked, my voice slicing through her remaining illusions. Do you want to know who paid for Chloe's designer bags and Marcus's tailored suits? They did not target wealthy hedge funds. They did not pitch their fake development projects to Wall Street bankers or elite venture capitalists. They targeted our own people. Vivian blinked, confusion fighting with the mounting dread in her eyes. What are you talking about? I walked back to the table and flipped the blue binder to the final section. The pages were filled with hundreds of names, addresses, and investment amounts. Marcus used his position as a respected, successful Black real estate broker to infiltrate our community, I explained, slamming my hand flat against the printed list of victims. He went to the local churches. He attended the community center galas. He sat in the living rooms of elderly Black couples who had spent 40 years working double shifts to build a retirement nest egg. He looked them directly in the eye, flashed that brilliant, trustworthy smile, and told them he had an exclusive opportunity to help them build generational wealth. The air in the dining room turned instantly toxic. The sheer gravity of the betrayal was finally sinking in. He told them they were investing in the revitalization of historic Black neighborhoods in Atlanta. I continued, my voice rising with undeniable, absolute authority. He sold them a dream of community empowerment, and they trusted him because he looked like them. They trusted him because he was married to the daughter of Vivian, one of the most prominent socialites in their church network. He weaponized your social standing, Mom. He used your reputation to convince retired teachers, postal workers, and small business owners to hand over their entire life savings. Vivian let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. She brought both hands up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The pristine, untouchable reputation she had spent decades meticulously cultivating was not just damaged. It was the exact tool her son-in-law had used to financially slaughter her own friends and neighbors. "You stole their pensions, Marcus," I said, staring at the back of his head. "You took the college funds they saved for their grandchildren. You took the equity out of the homes they spent decades paying off. You stripped an entire community of its financial security, and you handed all that stolen capital directly to Trenton so he could wash it through his white elite trust fund networks." Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably now, her face buried in her arms on the table. The reality of her lavish lifestyle was finally revealed for what it truly was. She was not a successful art gallery owner. She was a parasite feeding on the stolen life savings of elderly victims. Trenton tried to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We never forced anyone to invest. They signed the risk disclosures. They knew what they were doing." I stepped directly into Trenton's path, forcing him to freeze. "You targeted a marginalized demographic with zero sophisticated financial literacy. You used predatory affinity fraud to bypass their natural skepticism. You did not offer them a legitimate investment. You offered them a complete lie, and you used a Black frontman to make the lie palatable. Do you honestly think a federal jury is going to care about your risk disclosures when I put a 70-year-old retired nurse on the witness stand to explain how Marcus convinced her to mortgage her fully paid home?" Trenton swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, clearly calculating his odds of escaping the house. "There is no way out of this," I stated, reading his mind perfectly. "The federal prosecutors have the entire victim manifest. They have the wire transfers. They have the fake promotional brochures Marcus handed out at the Sunday church services. You completely devastated our community to line your own pockets. You treated their life savings as your personal piggy bank." I turned back to my mother, who was now weeping silently, the tears ruining her impeccable makeup. The reality of the situation had completely shattered her arrogance. "This is the man you defended, Mom," I said quietly. "This is the visionary you said was securing the future of this family. He did not build a legacy. He built a financial slaughterhouse, and he used your social circle as his primary hunting ground. When the federal indictment goes public tomorrow morning, every single person in your country club, every single member of your congregation will know exactly how Marcus funded Chloe's luxury apartment. They will know that your golden child's lifestyle was paid for with their stolen retirement funds." The absolute devastation in the room was complete. There was no more screaming. There were no more threats. There was only the suffocating, inescapable reality of their monumental crimes. They had believed they were untouchable elites playing a high-stakes game of Monopoly. I had just shown them they were nothing more than common thieves standing on the edge of a federal prison sentence. But I was not finished. The financial execution of my husband and my brother-in-law was deeply satisfying, but the ultimate betrayal had yet to be addressed. The final, most horrific piece of evidence was still waiting in the blue binder, and it was going to destroy the very foundation of the house we were currently standing in. I closed the heavy cover of the blue binder. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel striking the polished mahogany wood, signaling the end of one trial and the immediate beginning of another. I looked at the three criminals sitting at the table, their spirits completely shattered, their arrogant postures dissolved into pathetic, trembling shadows of their former selves. But my gaze did not linger on them. I slowly turned my attention back to the woman sitting at the head of the table. My mother Vivian was staring blankly at the wall, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She was attempting to process the sheer magnitude of the destruction her favorite son-in-law had just unleashed on her precious social circle. She thought the worst was over. She genuinely believed that the devastation was contained to her friend's retirement accounts and Chloe's impending federal indictment. She had absolutely no idea that the absolute epicenter of the blast zone was the very chair she was sitting in. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the table. I walked toward the grand fireplace, running my fingers lightly over the intricate hand-carved oak mantel. I looked up at the towering ceiling, admiring the imported crystal chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over the dining room. "This is a beautiful house, Mom," I said, my voice echoing softly against the expensive wallpaper. "It is the crown jewel of our family history. You spent decades cultivating this aesthetic. You hosted elite charity galas in this very room. You made sure every single person in your social strata knew that this estate was completely paid off, a testament to generational wealth and untouchable status. This house is your entire identity." Vivian swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward me. She did not understand why I was changing the subject to real estate, but the predatory calmness in my voice made her instantly defensive. "What does my house have to do with anything?" Vivian demanded, her voice barely more than a ragged whisper. "You have already ruined the dinner, Maya. You have already destroyed my reputation with your investigation. What more do you possibly want from me?" I turned around, leaning my back against the cold stone of the fireplace. "I do not want anything from you, Mom, because you do not have anything left to give." I crossed my arms, locking my eyes directly onto hers. "Do you remember the second week of October? It was a Tuesday evening. Marcus came over for a private dinner. Just the two of you." Vivian blinked, her brow furrowing as she desperately tried to search her memory. I watched her swallow again, her throat completely dry. "He brought a bottle of your favorite imported red wine." I continued, painting the picture with photographic precision. "He was wearing his best suit, flashing that brilliant, trustworthy smile you love so much. He told you he was expanding his commercial brokerage. He said he needed to restructure some corporate holding entities to maximize tax deductions before the end of the fiscal year. And he brought a stack of legal documents for you to sign." The color completely drained from Vivian's face. Her hands, which had been clutching the edge of the dining table, suddenly began to tremble violently. "He told you he was making you an honorary board member of his new development firm," I said, my words slicing through the room like a surgical blade. "He framed it as a beautiful family gesture. He told you it was a mere formality, just a few signatures required to register the corporate charter. And because you worshipped the ground he walked on, because you trusted the wealthy, successful husband of your golden child, far more than you ever trusted your own flesh and blood, you took his designer pen and you signed exactly where he pointed. You did not even bother to read the fine print." Vivian's breathing became audible, a harsh scraping sound in the dead quiet of the room. She turned her head slowly, looking at Marcus. Marcus had completely curled into himself. He was staring at his own lap, refusing to make eye contact with the woman he had just financially slaughtered. "Marcus," Vivian gasped, her voice cracking into a horrifying pitch. "Marcus, what did I sign?" Marcus did not answer. He simply squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could disappear into the floorboards. "I will tell you exactly what you signed, Mom," I announced, stepping away from the fireplace and walking back toward the table. "You see, running a massive Ponzi scheme requires constant, massive injections of liquid capital. When the early investors demand their quarterly returns, you have to pay them immediately to keep the illusion alive." But Trenton's trust fund wires were delayed by international banking regulations. Marcus was running out of cash, the fake dividends were due, and the elderly investors were starting to ask questions. He was desperate. He needed millions of dollars in untraceable liquid cash within 48 hours. I planted my hands firmly on the table, leaning directly into my mother's line of sight. "You cannot get that kind of capital from a traditional bank overnight," I explained, delivering the financial autopsy with ruthless clarity. You have to go to the shadow markets. You have to go to private, unregulated lenders. Shark lenders who operate completely outside the boundaries of federal law. But those people do not take iOS Mom. They do not care about Marcus's charm or Trenton's country club memberships. They demand hard, tangible, undeniable collateral, and they demand it up front. Vivian let out a low, agonizing moan. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. The documents you signed that Tuesday evening were not corporate charters, I stated, dropping the absolute final hammer. You signed a blanket lien and an irrevocable collateral transfer agreement. You legally handed over the deed to this entire estate. Marcus used your generational wealth, your pristine paid-off mansion, as the sole collateral to secure a high-risk predatory black market loan at an exorbitant 60% interest rate. No, Vivian shrieked, the sound tearing out of her throat with sheer primal terror. No, that is impossible. It is my house. It is in my name. Not anymore, I corrected her coldly. The second Marcus defaulted on his first shadow payment, and he defaulted 3 weeks ago because his cash flow completely dried up. The lenders executed the lien. The deed transferred automatically. You do not own the walls around you, Mom. You do not own the chandelier above your head. You do not own the ground you are sitting on. You are currently trespassing in a house owned by some of the most dangerous, ruthless financial predators on the eastern seaboard. The reality of the devastation hit Vivian with the physical force of a wrecking ball. The matriarch, who had spent her entire life judging others based on their zip codes and bank account balances, had just been stripped of everything. The mansion she prized above all else, the ultimate symbol of her superiority, had been gambled away by the son-in-law she constantly defended. Vivian tried to stand up. She pushed against the table, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She managed to rise an inch before her knees completely buckled beneath her. She let out a breathless, suffocating gasp and collapsed heavily back into her chair. Her upper body slumped forward, and she slid sideways, clutching frantically at the table runner to stop herself from hitting the floor. The expensive china plates and silverware crashed to the ground, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. Chloe screamed, jumping out of her chair and rushing to our mother's side. "Mom!" "Mom, breathe." Chloe grabbed Vivian's shoulders, trying to haul her back upright. Vivian swatted Chloe away with a violent, erratic swing of her arm. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as she stared at Marcus with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You stole my home." Vivian choked out, tears of absolute devastation pouring down her face. "You took my home. You took everything I have." Marcus finally looked up. His face was a mask of absolute cowardice. "I had to, Vivian. I had to secure the capital, or the entire operation would have collapsed. I was going to buy the deed back. I was going to pay them off as soon as Trenton's next offshore wire cleared. I swear to you, I was going to fix it." "You do not fix black market equity loans, Marcus," I interjected, ensuring he had absolutely nowhere to hide. "Those lenders do not send polite eviction notices in the mail. They do not wait for a court order. They send armed men to change the locks and throw your belongings onto the street. And given that your federal accounts are completely frozen, you have absolutely zero capital to buy this estate back." Vivian let out another agonizing, gut-wrenching wail. She slumped over the armrest of her chair, burying her face in her hands, her flawless imperial composure completely annihilated. The grand estate was lost. Her reputation was incinerated. Her golden child was facing decades in federal prison. And the architect of her complete destruction was the exact man she had praised all evening. Trenton, finally snapping out of his panicked paralysis, decided to make one last desperate play for control. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He was dialing the gated community's private security force. "Get out!" Trenton barked, trying to inject authority into a voice that was cracking with fear. "I am calling the neighborhood guards. You are trespassing Maya. You come in here spinning these insane lies, trying to terrorize my wife and my mother-in-law. You are leaving this property right now, even if I have to have you dragged out in handcuffs." I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and walked back over to the mahogany table. My mother was still weeping, clutching the edge of her chair, looking at Marcus as if he were a monster she had never seen before. Yet even now she clung to Trenton's aggressive intervention like a life raft. "You are defending them, Mom," I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air of the dining room. I tapped my index finger firmly against the polished wood of the table. "Trenton is calling security to throw your own daughter out into the street, and you are just sitting there hoping his trust fund can magically erase the fact that Marcus just gambled your entire legacy away. You still think they are your saviors." I reached into the blue binder one last time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of legal paper. It was not a bank statement or a wire transfer log. It was a certified, notarized transfer of deed and a primary lien holder agreement. I slid the document across the table. It came to a rest perfectly centered between my weeping mother and my sweating husband. "I told you that Marcus went to the shadow markets to secure that loan," I explained, my tone dropping to a dangerous, predatory whisper. "I told you he used this exact house as collateral for an exorbitant, predatory cash advance. But I did not tell you who the lender actually was." Trenton froze, the phone still pressed against his ear. The security dispatcher's voice buzzed faintly from the speaker, completely ignored. "When I saw the $85,000 charge at Cartier, I did not just freeze your accounts. Marcus," I said, locking my eyes onto my husband's pale, terrified face. "I tracked exactly where your cash flow had completely dried up. I found the underground lenders holding the paper on this estate. And because I am a federal investigator who understands exactly how to maneuver liquid assets, I took the inheritance my grandfather left me, and I established a blind shell corporation called Vanguard Resolution LLC. I tapped the document resting in front of my mother. "I did not just find your debt, Marcus. I bought it. I paid off the black market lenders in full at a premium to legally acquire the exclusive rights to the lien." Vivian stopped crying. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the paper. Chloe let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "I am not trespassing Trenton," I announced, my voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. "I am the sole legal creditor of this entire estate. I own the debt. I hold the deed. I own the very floorboards you are standing on. You cannot call security to throw me out of my own property, but I can absolutely call them to throw you out of mine." Vivian let out a sound that was barely human, a ragged gasp that seemed to tear the remaining air from the room. Her legs gave out completely. She crumpled to the hardwood floor, her expensive silk blouse tangling around her, as she buried her face in her hands, sobbing with the absolute broken hysteria of a woman who had just watched her entire kingdom burn to ash. But the horror was far from over for the golden child. Chloe had snatched up her own phone, her trembling fingers frantically tapping across the screen to check the status of her personal and joint accounts. I watched her perfectly manicured nails tap faster and faster. Suddenly, her phone slipped from her grasp and clattered against the table. She looked at Trenton, her eyes wide with a brand new, paralyzing terror. "He emptied it," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "You emptied everything." Trenton refused to look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the front door, his jaw tight. "You wired it all offshore," Chloe shrieked, grabbing his arm and shaking him violently. "Every single cent of our savings. You were going to leave me here to take the fall for the federal fraud while you fled the country. You were going to abandon your pregnant wife with the debt." Trenton shoved her hands away with a look of pure disgust. "It was my trust fund, Chloe. I am not going to federal prison because your idiot brother-in-law got sloppy with his wire transfers." As Chloe collapsed into a chair, screaming in absolute devastation, Marcus realized there was no escape. His business partner had planned to abandon him. His mother-in-law was weeping on the floor. His wife held the deed to the house and the keys to his destruction. Marcus dropped heavily to his knees right there on the Persian rug. He crawled forward, reaching out to grab the hem of my blazer. "Maya, please," Marcus begged, his face slick with tears and sweat. "I am so sorry. I lost my mind. I got in too deep and I panicked. I love you. Please, you do not have to turn over that binder. We can fix this. I will do anything you want. Just please do not let them take me away." I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling at my feet. I did not step back. I simply looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. I cannot stop what is already in motion, Marcus, I stated softly. I did not bring that dossier here to threaten you. I brought it here to show you exactly what I submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 6 o'clock this morning. Right on cue, the faint, piercing wail of sirens bled through the heavy, insulated windows of the mansion. The sound grew louder, multiplying and echoing across the manicured lawns of the gated community. Red and blue lights began to flash violently against the dining room windows, painting the horrified faces of my family in strobe lights. Trenton bolted for the back patio doors, but he did not make it past the kitchen threshold. The heavy mahogany front doors burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen armed federal agents flooded into the grand foyer, their tactical boots stomping over the expensive marble floors. Nobody move. Hands where we can see them. Two agents grabbed Trenton, slamming him face first onto the kitchen island and snapping cold steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Another agent hauled Marcus up from the floor by the collar of his expensive tailored suit, twisting his arms behind his back. The clinking of the handcuffs sounded like music to my ears. I stood perfectly still, watching the two arrogant architects of this massive financial slaughterhouse get dragged out of the dining room in chains right in the middle of our traditional Sunday dinner. 72 hours after the federal raid, the grand estate in Alpharetta was entirely stripped of its suffocating prestige. The heavy oak front doors stood wide open, letting the crisp morning air sweep through the foyer. I stood on the pristine marble entryway, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the final pathetic remnants of my family's fabricated empire get shoved into the trunks of two heavily used sedans. Chloe was dragging a taped-up cardboard box across the hardwood floor. Her designer pastel dresses and expensive handbags had already been seized by federal authorities to pay back a fraction of the restitution she owed the defrauded investors. She was wearing cheap sweatpants, her hair tied up in a messy knot, completely stripped of the golden child glamour she had weaponized against me her entire life. She was weeping as usual, but these tears were different. They were the agonizing tears of a woman who had just realized she would be spending the next 30 years paying off millions in federal restitution on a minimum wage salary. My mother Vivian walked out of the living room holding a single small suitcase. The matriarch who had ruled this house with an iron fist looked like a broken hollow shell. The pearls were gone. The arrogant posture had completely collapsed. She stopped a few feet away from me, her eyes darting to the floor, absolutely terrified to look me in the eye. "Maya, please, Vivian," whispered, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Where are we supposed to go? We have absolutely nothing left. The banks took the cars. The government froze the accounts. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. I am your mother." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence hang between us one last time. "You stopped being my mother the day you sacrificed my future to fund her entitlement," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the high ceilings. "You built an entire life by leeching off my hard work, my sacrifices, and finally my inheritance. But the bank is officially closed, Vivian. The free ride is completely over." Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob, dropping her box onto the marble floor. "But what am I supposed to do? Trenton left me with all the legal fees. I do not have a college degree. I do not have a resume. I suggest you start filling out job applications, Chloe," I replied, my gaze locking onto her terrified face. "There is a diner 2 blocks from your new studio apartment that is hiring shift managers. It is honest blue-collar work. The exact kind of work you and your husband used to mock at this very dining table. You wanted a launching pad. Now you have one. You can use your first paycheck to start paying back the elderly investors your husband stole from." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to beg for one last shred of mercy, but she saw the absolute terrifying finality in my eyes. The scapegoat had not just survived the slaughter. She had bought the entire farm. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the open doorway with my free hand. "It is time to leave my property. Do not come back." The heavy oak doors of the Heritage Mansion closed with a deep, resonant thud, sealing away the ghosts of my past forever. I did not stand on the porch to watch their cars drive away. I simply turned the deadbolt, locked out a lifetime of conditional love and endless manipulation, and finally exhaled. The bright suburban morning light of Alpharetta slowly dissolves into the sleek neon glow of the Atlanta skyline at midnight. We are back in the penthouse. The air up here is distinctly different. It is not weighed down by the suffocating expectations of a toxic matriarch or the desperate greed of a golden child. Up here, 50 stories above the chaotic streets, the silence is purely manufactured by my own design. It is the absolute unbroken peace of a woman who was thrown to the wolves and returned to buy the entire forest. The visual energy shifts, no longer frantic or tense. A Steadicam glides smoothly across the polished dark hardwood floor, slowly circling the velvet sofa where I am sitting. The city lights reflect in the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting a brilliant, shimmering halo around my silhouette. I am wearing a tailored emerald green suit, the uniform of a woman entirely in command of her own empire. I raise the crystal glass of dark red wine to my lips. The vintage is exquisite, paid for by the honest, hard-earned salary of a federal investigator who refuses to compromise her integrity for anyone. I take a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, complex flavor of total victory. As the camera continues its fluid, continuous orbit around my chair, it gradually pushes in closer. The luxurious backdrop of the penthouse slowly falls out of focus, leaving nothing but my face sharply illuminated in the center of the frame. My posture is perfectly straight. My expression is completely devoid of any lingering sorrow, bitterness, or regret. I have surgically extracted the infection from my life, and the wound has already healed into iron. I lower the wine glass and lock my eyes directly onto the camera lens, staring straight through the glass to address the audience with terrifying, absolute certainty. They say blood is thicker than water. My voice echoes in the quiet room, layered as a cold, calculating voiceover. But sometimes blood is exactly what gets you infected the fastest. Sometimes the people who share your last name are the very same people trying to forge it on a fraudulent check. A faint knowing smile touches the corners of my mouth. If they treat you like trash, I continue my gaze, never once wavering from the lens. Just remember, sometimes trash makes the absolute best paper trail for a conviction. The screen cuts abruptly, fading into absolute infinite black.